You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Bryan, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. A couple of months ago, we discussed on one of our previous podcasts about drones and the technology that farmers are using now to monitor some of the infield issues that they may have and how the drones have helped out with a bit of the scouting. The other half of that equation, of course, is not using drones, and we touched on it a bit, but it's actually using satellites to observe what's going on in the fields and gathering data about agriculture in that manner. We're talking today with Dr. Andrew Davidson. Andrew is the manager of Earth Observation Operations for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and at the Centre for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Centre for Agroclimate, Geomatics, and Earth Observation. We're going to be talking today about some exciting new technology that's been developed as far as satellites go. Andrew, welcome to the Back 40.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
For our listeners that don't know who you are, could you give us a bit of a background as to how you got involved in looking after the satellites for agriculture?
Sure, no problem. It's not a long story, a fairly linear one. I first got into this type of research and this type of application in my second year of university. So way back in 1990, I was studying at the University of Edinburgh. I was in the Department of Physical Geography there, and I was trying to pick some courses for my second year, and a couple of new courses appeared on the course calendar, one of which was digital image processing. And digital image processing class back in 1990 had to do with processing satellite images. And this was the first time that course was offered. It was a completely new thing. It seemed kind of cool. So I took the course, did well in it. And way back then, back in 1990, the technology wasn't what it is today. We were working on something called the gemstone image processor that basically looked like a cross between a slot machine and an ultrasound machine with big buttons and a big trackball. But it could handle satellite imagery. It handled Landsat satellite imagery, 512 by 512 pixels, and you could do some really cool stuff with it. And even though at the time, because we weren't graduate students, we didn't get the choice slots of working on there. Basically, this thing ran 24/7, and we get the slots between 2 and 4 a.m. I really liked it, and I continued my studies in this area. And then on graduation, I got a scholarship to come to Canada to do a master's at the University of Toronto, where I focused on satellite monitoring of soils, salt-affected soils. And then that rolled into a PhD where I did the satellite monitoring of grasslands, and particularly Canadian grasslands. And I did a lot of work out in Western Canada at Grasslands National Park, based in Val-Marie, Saskatchewan. I spent 4 summers out there doing spectral measurements and scaling them up and looking at satellite-based observations of grassland productivity and diversity.
So you've been involved in having a look from space for quite a long time here. What are we, as far as the state of the art right now, where are we in Canada as far as the observation of agricultural lands?
We're pretty advanced. I think between, say, for example, the federal government, the provinces, also industry and academia, there's a lot of really great innovative science coming out of Canada in this realm. And there's a variety of things that we do particularly well at. So, for example, with the federal government, Agriculture Canada's Earth Observation Unit, I lead that unit. We're considered one of the world's most advanced agricultural remote sensing programs. We're not a big unit, there's only 5 or 6 of us, but we do punch well above our weight in terms of the money invested in the kinds of things that we're doing and the cutting edge science that we're actually doing. And the same would go for, I think, the provinces and industry as well, doing some really great research in this sphere. Canada's most well known, I think, in the Earth observation realm for synthetic aperture radar satellites, a type of satellite that uses microwave remote sensing to say or tell us about what's on the ground surface. And way back as far as 1995 with the launch of RADARSAT-1, and then in 2007 with the subsequent launch of RADARSAT-2, and then the RADARSAT-Constellation a couple of years ago, Canada really has advanced the technology in synthetic aperture radar for many applications, security and flood mapping and forestry and many types of things, but especially also agriculture. So Canada really is considered a leader in this field.
So, how many satellites are you generally working with where you collect the data that you work with?
As as many as possible. It changes. If it's open, if it's free, we'll grab it. Luckily for us, there's a whole bunch of data streams out there coming from satellites that are open and free that we can use. We use Canadian satellites. We use satellites coming from our international partners. Because I work for a Canadian federal department, we try to do things as efficiently as possible. And what that involves is primarily what we're looking at is using open and free data that are available to us. So right now, for example, we're using the Canadian RADARSAT-Constellation mission, the RADARSAT-SAR satellites. We're also using a bunch of satellites from the United States, for example, the Landsat satellites that people will have heard of, Aqua and Terra, that are other types of satellites coming from NASA and the US Department of Agriculture and the US Geological Survey. And we're also using satellites run by the Copernicus program in the European Union. So, for example, the Sentinels. And we're also, for research and development purposes, using satellites from places such as Germany, Japan, Argentina, and even China. So basically, if the data is open, if the data is good, if we can use that data in our day-to-day operations, and we've designed all our systems to basically take any type of satellite stream and feed it into what we're doing, we're very data agnostic in that sense, then we're going to use it. And the exciting part is, as more streams go up there, that will give us more access to more data.
Now, when you're talking about data, are you talking strictly photographs, or is there other information that's coming through as well?
Well, so primarily we're looking at satellite images, so the traditional satellite images that people will be familiar with. And to understand sort of how these satellites work, and in the sort of subsequent discussion of satellites that we're actually going to have today, is what we have to realize is it's kind of two flavors of satellites, right? So the first flavor of satellites, the first type, are what we call optical sensors. These are the ones that are just like big digital cameras in space taking pictures of the Earth's surface. And what they're actually doing is they're measuring the solar radiation that's reflected or emitted by the Earth's surface, right? So basically, these are sensors measuring in the blue, green, red, near infrared, shortwave infrared, thermal infrared wavelengths. And that's what we refer to as optical sensors. And there's a whole ton of these missions, international missions with optical sensors, and many of which that we actually utilize. On the other hand, there's sort of a second flavor, a second type of satellite called synthetic aperture radar. And this is the thing that Canada is quite well known for. And what synthetic aperture radar satellites are is these are similarly orbiting satellites, but they have their own source of energy on board that satellite. And what they do is they ping that energy towards the ground, and then they monitor that backscatter of that energy from the land surface. And the amount of energy that comes back towards the satellite and how it backscatters towards the satellite tells us something about what's there and what condition it is, etc. So these SAR satellites don't operate in the optical domain. They operate in microwave wavelengths that are very, very different. But combined, both of these satellites give us complementary and very, very good information. On top of that, we don't really use airborne missions a lot for our operational monitoring, at least within my unit, because we're responsible for national scale wall-to-wall monitoring. But some of our research and development scientists, for example, at Agroclimate Canada, use airborne missions, or they use drones for that matter. So not traditional photographs, but sort of multispectral imagery crossing the variety of sensors that I've just mentioned. We use all of these things.
So that's a lot of different types of data that you're collecting, a lot of different sources, a lot of different formats that it comes to you in. What sort of things can you tell from that data?
So first of all, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the different formats and the different types of data any operational system that we build or that we put into place has to take into account these kinds of things. So it's not quite plug and play, right? These different missions have data, not just in different formats, but different geographic projections, different calibration coefficients, and all these kinds of things. So it takes a significant effort, I would say, to integrate all these data together. And this is what I would say about the power of satellite remote sensing. People will often ask me, what can you do with RADARSAT missions? Primarily because it's a Canadian mission and people want to know what we can do with it. And what I always say is I think the power is integrating the data from these different missions together, along with other geospatial data, whether it be ground data or survey data or other ways, to come up with what we would call value-added products. And especially in terms of, for example, the federal government, what we're talking about is public good information. So what our unit does is we create a variety of these types of informational products that are made available free and open to Canadians through the Government of Canada data portal. The most well-known, for example, would be our annual space-based crop inventory. The space-based crop inventory is where we map land use and land cover within Canada's agricultural extent every single year. So what we do is we use the spectral information along with ground-based information, and we integrate all that together. Each year we have about 1,000 to 1,500 images from all these different satellites that get used with these data. And what we do is we map the most probable crop type in any given field, and we also map the non-agricultural cover types too. The value of this for the sector is that what we know is that through open data, that the annual space-based crop inventory is one of Government of Canada's most downloaded geospatial data sets and one of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's most downloaded data sets too. So for example, the month of April, our 2020 release had 400 downloads of that data set alone. The difficulty we have, of course, is, tracking who's using these kinds of things and for what. And that is because just of the nature of open data, right? When the Government of Canada, when we put our data up onto the platform and people can access it, by the nature of the fact that it's open and through the license that people have to use it, we don't track who's downloading it and we don't track what they're using it for. And that becomes a bit of a problem for us because, when I have to go back to my management and say, hey, listen, this is all the cool applications of the data, it's very difficult to do that. So what we rely on is we rely on a lot of feedback from industry, from academia, from other Government of Canada departments, for example, to talk about the kinds of things that people are using with the data and why they find it important. I can give you some examples. So we're generating these value-added products and we're putting these out there for the sector to use. We have companies using these data, for example, as independent validations for ag land, for aggregating carbon offsets. We have people using the data, for example, for mapping flooded areas by crop type for insurance claims, calibrating models for estimating seeded acres, grain draw for elevators, for all different types of really cool things. And these are the things we actually know about, which is a very small subset of the wide range of applications that the data is being used for. And this is the really cool part about generating these data sets. Originally, we thought, hey, this is going to be used for specific applications, maybe, just a few of them. But what we're really realizing is that the broad application of these data, literally covering hundreds of applications, is way wider than we could ever have imagined to begin with.
Now, I can just hear farmers saying, you know what, that's all very well and good, but, just give me the data. I just want to see the data. Just hand it over to me so I can tell and make decisions.
They don't want the data. They don't, believe me, you don't want the data. No. To be serious, it's, my answer to that is twofold, right? And it's like anything in life, anything technical in life, is that things are just not as simple as they look. And especially when it comes to synthetic aperture radar data, right? So we often talk within the Earth observation realm about what we call analysis-ready data. And that is data that's made available for people to drop into their systems, into their geographic information systems, or whatever software they have, and do analytics on them. The analysis-ready data is fairly mature for these types of optical systems that I talked about, because the type of processing that you do on those data to actually get them ready for use tend to be fairly consistent across applications. applications. The same is not the case with synthetic aperture radar. And what that requires is a fairly good knowledge and a fairly good background in the field in terms of how you actually process these data and make them available. So the reality is, if we have clients, for example, are saying we just want SAR data, there's a very good chance they'll be dropping that SAR data to their drives and looking at it and not really being able to make head nor tail of what this really means in terms of what they really want from it. And this is why I say, when we talk to farmers, producers, and industry, what we say is that because these data quite often are quite difficult to turn into something useful. So for example, synthetic aperture radar has some very, very good applications for surface soil moisture. It is the role, for example, of industry and or the federal government to do the kind of processing and the kind of research, development, and operationalization to produce what we would call these value-added products that then get put into the public domain. So, when I talk to farmers and I talk to producers, and we do fairly often, I say, do you really want the data or do you want something derived from it? Do you want the data or do you want soil moisture? And most of the time, it is the latter. And the industry is different, right? There's some great Canadian industry work being done, whether it be precision ag or in other realms that are taking the data as it is and generated these sort of commercial products as well. So, but from a producer perspective, and especially if you live in rural places where perhaps your internet connection is not that great, then you have the additional problem of, downloads and uploads and these kinds of things. So to me, the power of these data for decision making sort of at that farm level isn't necessarily pulling down the data and looking at it. It's what industry and the federal government and the provinces can actually do in terms of building applications that can then be used by everybody else. And those value added data and applications speak to really useful things, such, for example, as soil moisture in this case.
Do you like what you're hearing from the Back 40? We'd like to hear from you. Send us an email with your comments and thoughts to theback40@trilliummutual.com or follow us on social media @trilliummutual. So a lot of what you're doing for research and what your data that you're, not necessarily data, but the information that you're putting out there, this isn't something that has a direct commercial application. You're not going to sell this to someone. You're doing work there that is something that, as you said, it's open source. What's the reason for that? Why, as government, what's your role in putting out information there if it's not from a commercial standpoint?
From our perspective in the division that I work for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, we've never been one of these cost recovery sort of government units. And we realized a long time ago that there's a role for government in producing public good information that probably won't be done by the private sector because it's a fairly, what we would call sort of a fairly weak, I think, business line. For example, if you take a look at the annual space-based crop inventory and you take a look at other governments in other countries, what we see is that most other governments' countries are actually making these data available for free. And to be honest with you, even here in Canada, there would be that expectation that these kinds of data get produced by the federal government and get distributed free of charge. We often do get asked, well, why shouldn't industry do this? Or why wouldn't industry do this? And I always say, the question is, are people willing to pay for that kind of data? And what we've seen internationally is that people are becoming less and less inclined to pay for land use, land cover data. And there is that expectation that this is something that is produced as an independent authoritative data set by the government and put into the public realm for people to use. And I would generally agree with that. I mean, over the 20 years ago, when I first got into this field, people were selling these kinds of data, right? They were selling land use, land cover maps across the board and making some money from it. But over the last 10 years, there's been this acknowledgement, I think, from government that this is something that we should be doing and the benefits to the sector, whereby if we can do this and we can do this well, and then we start to take a look at the value that this has to the sector, then what we can allow the sector in general to do, whether it be industry, academia, or the provinces, for example, do the things that we're very, very good at, right? So what that means is instead of classifying remote sensing data and creating sort of land use, land cover maps, all of a sudden everybody's working from a consistent, highly accurate set of maps. Everybody has the same thing, and then they can focus their attention on using that within their business lines to do other business. So we think that there's this role in government for us to produce these data free of charge, open to everybody. It has a very high value, at least we know, in terms of its use, and this frees people up to pursue other lines of inquiry. And what I would say also is that one of the things we've tried to balance is sort of as a federal government department is we don't get in the way of industry. So in that sense, with respect to the work that my unit does, is we've stayed out of the precision agricultural field, pardon the pun, but we've stayed out of that realm. And we stayed out of that realm because industry does it pretty well. So what we've said to innovators, to industry, we've said to them is that we're going to continue producing our national scale wall-to-wall data. And every so often, we're going to come over to your sandbox and maybe throw a little bit of sand in and by the way of data and say, hey, listen, we've done some of these things. Can you guys use that? Is that any good? Can you give us some feedback? But we're certainly not going to be infringing on the livelihood or operations of industry. And up until this point in time, we've done a very good job with that, I think. And it's very much something at the front of our minds.
Fair to say you're not in the business of competing with the companies out there. You're more in the business of providing them with the building blocks that they need in order to compete both provincially, nationally, and internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're trying to support, we're trying to empower, we're trying to provide data that people otherwise probably wouldn't have access to, or if they would have access to, would probably have to invest a significant amount of resources in generating. So our general sort of idea is that what we're trying to do is put data into the public domain there that can help other people without competing with them. And to our knowledge, I mean, we know that perhaps that, say, for example, there's people in industry doing small land use, land cover maps for detailed areas that meet their specific purposes, but we're not competing with that, right? We're putting things out at a detailed level that speaks to sort of this national wall-to-wall mapping. And certainly, we have no intention of competing with industry in that realm. In fact, what we want to do is just support and empower. And hopefully, if by providing that sort of value-added information, then Canadian companies have a little bit of a leg up when it comes to certain types of analytics, and maybe they're a little bit more innovative or a little bit more competitive, then that's fantastic. That's what we want.
Now, you spoke a bit about people that were after soil moisture and finding out the information from an agronomic standpoint. And certainly, I know a lot of farmers that would love to have that information. But there's some limitations within your system. What sort of limitations would you have to be able to even to provide the raw data for soil moisture for someone to make use of that on a commercial basis?
That's a good question. The application, for example, to mapping soil moisture at fairly fine spatial resolution, so fairly small pixels, is something we've been working towards, certainly in sort of R&D, but like you say, there's a massive amount of sort of limitations there. If we take a sort of a step back and we actually sort of consider in terms of surface soil moisture products and what's available, there are some available. There are some available nationally. We, for example, are using data from passive microwave from the European Space Agency, but the pixels are huge. The pixels are 25 kilometers by 25 kilometers. And that meets certain applications, right? I mean, if you're into numerical weather prediction like Environment Canada, or you're doing broad scale applications, climate modeling, these kinds of things, people love that type of data. But of course, pixels at 25 by 25 kilometers have really limited use for people on the ground and managing farm operations. We did do a fair bit of research under a project funded by the Canadian Space Agency quite recently, where we were looking at ways to map surface soil moisture at fairly small pixels. Now, fairly small pixels means different things to different people, but because we were using synthetic aperture radar from the RADARSAT satellites, we're talking about 20 meters in this respect. And 20 meters is sort of a sweet spot for us because you can get that sort of wall-to-wall in operational imagers that have wide swaths and allow you a great amount of coverage. But, if you want 1 meters or you want 50 centimeters or you want something smaller than that, then it becomes a lot trickier. You certainly can't get that from the RADARSAT constellations, and probably can't get that easily now from any synthetic aperture radar system. And the reason we like to use SAR is because when you're using certain types of SAR imagery, it's been shown that you can get some pretty accurate surface soil moisture retrievals from the ground. But here are the limitations. And this is what your original question was about. The first is pixel size, of course. If you're operating at 20 meters, it's still subfield level, but it might not quite be the detail that you require for your precision agriculture applications. The second thing too is the availability of the data. For something to be sort of an operational system, what you want to do is you want to have these routine operations. So you might want, for example, soil moisture once a day. You might need it once a week. Some applications just require it once a month. But if we consider for farm operations that you want it at least weekly, maybe every couple of days, from the systems that are available orbiting over Canada right now, including the RADARSAT-Constellation, over Canada's agricultural extent, we cannot get SAR data covering our agricultural lands with this repeat frequency, right? So the data to actually do that mapping at the frequency required, it just isn't available. And then one of the other limitations actually has to do with the modeling. What we've shown is that we can model actually really well surface soil moisture outside of the growing season. So pre-seeding and after harvest, you can actually do a really good job. But once you have a plant canopy in the way and things are growing, it becomes a problem. And it's a problem because your SAR signal, the energy backscattered to your sensor, is a mixture of the soil response and the canopy response. So what you have to do is you have to get into mathematical water cloud modeling. You try and subtract the influences of the canopy to try and get at the surface soil moisture, et cetera, et cetera. And then on top of that, when you start to take a look at the results, and we've done this over a number of field sites. We had field sites in Manitoba, we had field sites in Ontario. The question really becomes about the geographic sort of portability of your model. So if that model's been developed for certain crop types over certain soil types, can you really take that model and apply it elsewhere? And the answer is you have to be very, very careful when you do that, because corn over different types of soil are going to require probably models with different parameterization. So the limitations are many right now: access to the data, but also the status of the modeling. And we're getting a lot better with the modeling. The modeling, not just done here in Canada at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, but elsewhere in Canada, but also internationally, would tell us that we're really getting to a point with the surface soil moisture modeling that we can do a fairly good job. But it's data access and refining that model to be broad scale, wall-to-wall mapping. And it's a big challenge. It's absolutely a big challenge. However, we're holding out hope and we're ever optimistic. And, we have sort of a 5-year plan, hopefully, to have something that's semi-workable over good chunks of the country. So, watch the space for details.
So I'm going to ask you to gaze a little bit into your crystal ball here. What are we looking at for the next breakthroughs in this type of technology? Is it going to be new technology on the satellites, or is this going to be different modeling or different algorithms that we're going to run the data through? Where do you see those next breakthroughs coming from?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I think it's going to be a mixture of everything, because sort of when I sort of look back on my career 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, what would happen is people would say, where's the biggest limitation to what you do with the Earth observation monitoring from space? We'd always say there's just not enough data, or the pixels are too big, right? These days, that's not the case. We have a massive amount of data coming through. But as I've mentioned, previously, for some applications, we don't have enough data. But generally speaking, there's a massive amount of data there, and data tends not to be the issue. And as the sensor technology gets better, as the satellites get smaller, the optics get better, the engineering gets better, downlinking gets better. What that means is that we're able to bring our pixels from fairly large pixels, 30 meters, down to 20 meters, 10 meters, 5 meters, 2 meters, these kinds of things. So what we've seen over the last number of years in terms of the developments, it's basically more frequent imagery being acquired at smaller pixels. But in terms of what the next big breakthroughs are, I think it's going to be along the same veins. It's going to be better imagery. It's going to be imagery with smaller pixels. It's going to be better repeat cycles. So for example, instead of getting an image, for example, once a week, maybe we can get an image once a day. Maybe we can get multiple images a day. For example, it's going to be better algorithms for looking at yield, or looking at soil moisture, or looking at crop cover or residue, or these kinds of things, the things that we tend to be interested in. It's going to be better IT infrastructure software and hardware, that means that we actually don't have to download data anymore. It's going to be that wholesale transition to the cloud, whereby a click of a button, all that processing is done on some cloud computing network that's not your desktop, right? So you don't have to download terabytes of data anymore. You're simply taking your algorithms to the data rather than bringing your data to the algorithms. And that's going to make an absolute massive difference. And a good example of that is 10, 15 years ago, I built a system that does near real-time crop condition, requires me to download all the data from a NASA site, and then you do all the processing and all these kinds of things. And it takes about 6 hours to run, which isn't terrible. But everything gets dropped down to a drive on my system. And if the internet's out, it's a problem. Or, if there's connection issues, it's a problem, et cetera, et cetera. Nowadays, even now, I can go into Google Earth Engine and I can use their cloud-based system. And if I wanted to, I could probably condense 16,000 lines of code into 500. And when I press that button, boom, it runs just like that. It runs in about 20 seconds, right? So we're seeing, this IT infrastructure and hardware, that's going to make a massive difference. And then also we're going to see, I think, sort of the amalgamation of these kinds of things giving us better value-added products, quicker, faster, with more accuracy. And we're not going to be able to predict it, but this technology tends to come a lot quicker than we previously, I think, imagine it might.
I certainly think that the information that we have had access to in the last 10 years is something that in my wildest dreams when I was in school, I never thought we'd be able to get.
Absolutely. And it's incredible. I mean, when you think about it now, and, we talk about the future, and I say, in the future, we'll be able to do these kinds of things. Or there would be some people of commercial space companies listening to this, people I know who are going to say, well, we're doing it right now. And commercially, they are. There's certain commercial space companies, for example, who have massive constellations of satellites. You have the flying shoeboxes that are taking very, very fine resolution measurements on a daily basis over agricultural regions and many regions of the planet. The thing from our perspective is this technology, it's maturing, it's getting better in terms of calibration and its usability. There were some teething problems, I think, in the past where we've looked at some of these types of data in terms of implementation into an operational system. But from a federal perspective, my perspective, the only downfall is the commercial side, whereby I couldn't afford to pay for those data, for example, over Canada every single day for an entire growing season. And I do know how much that would cost the federal government, and it's an extremely large amount of money. But if you are doing targeted applications, right? So let's just say, for example, you're a company, you're not interested in the wall-to-wall national scale applications such as we are, but you're doing consulting and you're targeting those kinds of applications on farms in certain regions. Well, you know what? Maybe those imagery become affordable to you to use in your applications. And one of the real interesting things too is that a lot of these space companies, I think, are moving away from selling the data to selling services. They're what we call VASPs, the value-added service providers. So what they're trying to do is saying, listen, you know what, we could sell you the data, and we could even sell you the data to download. But what we could also do is sell you a service where you're not looking at the data per se, but what you're doing is you're getting some kind of data product that we're generating from the original data. Very similar to the kinds of things I've talked about in terms of sort of the government's role in taking source data and creating value-added information from it. And I think that will also be one of the ways of the future where people provide services rather than data.
Don't sell the data, sell me the information, because I really don't care about the data. I want to know what that data is going to tell me. So
absolutely.
If you can process that and give me that information, I don't have to do that myself.
Yeah, and you know what? The thing with data is it takes up a lot of time to process. When I actually teach at the university, I've taught remote sensing at the university. What I tell my students is that when you get into this field, it's a lot better now, but you can spend up to 80% of your time processing data to make it usable. Why would you do that if somebody else says, we will do that for you? Right? Because time is valuable for absolutely everybody. Time is money, right? So what I always say, and I even say this to our group, I say, if we can actually get out of doing certain types of data processing and have, for example, the data vendors or the governments from which we're getting the data from do a lot of that upstream processing for us as part of their automatic sort of open and free data processing stream, then I'm all for that, because that allows us to concentrate on the things that my unit, my division is really good at. And that is the sort of the geoanalysis, spatial analysis of questions and problems relating to Canada's agriculture.
Suffice it to say that this technology is only going to get better, and we're going to get more and more usable information out of it. Andrew, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. We've been speaking with Dr. Andrew Davidson from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada about satellite systems and some of the information that we've been able to gather from that.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to The Back 40. Join us next time when our guest will be Heather Watson, Executive Director with Farm Management Canada, and we'll be talking about the link between business planning and mental health. You've been listening to The Back 40, brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Be sure to subscribe to The Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.